Hi, and welcome back to our 8-step guide to working as an interpreter. In this particular session, we're going to look at steps 6, 7, and 8. So we're going to look at agreeing your rates and contact details, receiving and accepting assignments, and then, of course, the most important part of all, completing the assignment so that you can get paid. So first of all, let's have a look at step 6, which is agreeing your rates and contact details. Now, in terms of interpreting rates, it does differ from translation in the way that in a lot of cases, the rates will actually already be set by the language service provider. So it's not necessarily a case of you actually setting a rate for yourself. Often the language service provider will have an agreed rate for working on a particular contract, and they will offer you the work on that contract, and they will agree the rate up front. So the actual rate itself will vary often by language specialism, client and experience. So some clients pay more than others. If you've got more experience, you might be able to ask for higher rates. Sometimes the language service providers have like an introductory rate if you haven't got much experience so that you can get work and build that experience up. The specialism has an impact as well. So for example, if you're working on things like legal interpreting cases, that will generally pay higher than medical, but not in all cases. And of course, by language as well, if you've got what's classed as a rare language, so that means a language that not necessarily rare as in the number of speakers worldwide, but the number of interpreters available for that language, then sometimes the rates are higher as well. Generally, for face-to-face, a language service provider will pay an hourly rate. So normally a minimum booking for an appointment would be an hour. That might be something like a medical appointment, and then you'd be paid the agreed rate per hour. You might also get things like travel time, but that would generally be agreed on a case-by-case basis. So you'd need to make sure from the language service provider what the terms are for that. You might also be paid per minute on phone, so telephone interpreting or over the phone interpreting and video interpreting. So if you do those ones, because it's sort of logged all by a system, they can actually bill it to the minute itself. So instead of getting an hourly rate for the whole appointment, you'll actually get paid per minute for the actual work that you do. So there might be times where you are asked to agree a rate, certainly when you are enrolling for a language service provider in the first instance, or if they've got a new contract where they're asking you to try and set the rates for yourself. So if you are in the situation where you're agreeing or setting your rates, there's a few things to keep in mind. First of all, you want to be competitive. You don't want to sell yourself short, so you don't want to undervalue yourself and try and undercut everyone else that's out there. But you also don't want to charge too much, even if you think that your service is worth a lot of money. Now, as I was talking about earlier, if you've got a really rare language, then to a certain degree, you might be able to actually be quite competitive and set your rates quite high. But generally, you want to see what the competition are doing. You want to find out what kind of rates people who speak your language with your kind of experience are charging, and you want to set your rates around about the same. So it is quite tempting sometimes to try and undercut the competition. So for example, if you're speaking to a language service provider and they're saying that for your language, the rates are £15 an hour, it might be really tempting to get more work to try and drop that, for example, to something like £12 per hour. The problem with that is that you're then undervaluing the profession, and all you're really doing is starting off a chain reaction, which means that everyone else will start dropping their rates, and ultimately it's just going to become a race to the bottom, and you're going to cut everybody's rates, and ultimately it's not going to be sustainable. You'll have a lot of people doing a lot of work for not very much money. So please resist that temptation, and as I say, be competitive. Don't overprice yourself, but don't underprice yourself either. And overriding that as well, be prepared to change. So when you first go in, you might have a particular rate in mind. You might not want to drop below that particular rate because you think that that's what you're worth. And fair enough, you're absolutely within your rights to do that. But if you're not actually getting any work from it and the rates are a problem, maybe the language service provider are letting you know that the rates are a bit high for certain clients that they work with, then be prepared to change as well. Be a bit flexible because that will help you out in the long run as well. And it is important to get that experience, to get work, of course, so you can get paid. And then further down the line, sometimes you can revisit that or qualify for different jobs that are paid higher. It's also important when we're talking about rates to make sure that your contact details are absolutely right with your language service provider as well. And the reason for that is because jobs are actually sent to you a number of ways. So first of all, jobs can be sent to you by email. So obviously, if they don't have your correct email address, you're not going to receive those jobs. Secondly, you might get phoned up with job opportunities as well, particularly if it's short notice. So again, it's absolutely critical that you need to keep your phone number up to date. Particularly keep that in mind as well. If you are changing mobile phone provider, for example, and your number's changing, make sure that one of the first things that you do is make sure that that phone number is updated with the relevant language service providers or clients. You can also get jobs by text message. So again, that comes into the importance of being set up by phone. And some language service providers as well will have their own apps. So you need to make sure you're logged into those apps, that you've downloaded them so that you can actually receive information through those apps as well. There might be some kind of configuration that you need to do on the app as well. So make sure that's up to date as well so that you're not missing any opportunities. So as I say, it's crucial that your interpreter profile is kept up to date. If there's any changes, if you move house, for example, then it's really important that you make sure that you contact the language service provider and update your profile. Sometimes you can do that yourself. Other times you need to get in contact with them or send them an email. But always make sure your contact details are correct, because essentially that's where you're going to be making money. Some jobs as well, it's worth noting, are allocated on location. So these are obviously face-to-face jobs. And sometimes the algorithm that the language service providers use will actually look at the location of the interpreter when it comes to making a decision. Normally, obviously, that has an impact on travel time. So if you live in Birmingham, it's unlikely you're going to get a job in London unless you've got a particularly rare language, because the language service provider isn't going to want to pay you, 2 hours each way travel time to get there and back. So obviously, they'll try and find someone in London. But it even comes down sometimes to people who live nearer to something like a hospital are more likely to get a job. There's other factors as well, but I have known people to even move house interpreters so they're closer to where they work, so that they can get more jobs. But again, it's really important, keeping that in mind, to have the correct address updated on the system. You may also need security clearances. Generally, that would start with the basic disclosure, so you'll need that to register with most language service providers in the first instance. But you might also be asked for different security clearances to work with different clients. So if you have got a security clearance, or you've got a new one, or that's been updated, again, it's important to make sure that your profile is up to date with that information. And also insurance. So already talked about insurance in a different webinar, so you can check that one out if you want to. It's all about insurance. But again, some language service providers won't work with you if you don't have any insurance at all. And depending on what type of insurance you have, that might also impact the kind of work that you can actually get. And the final thing to make sure is up to date on your profile is your CPD and qualifications. So if you are regularly doing CPD, make sure you're logging that. It's not essential for most language service providers at the moment, or even professional bodies at the moment, but that is something that will probably change in the future. So the more CPD you can log, again, the more likely you are to be able to qualify for certain jobs. Obviously, if you get a new qualification, then it's important to log that as well, particularly if it's something in terms of interpreting. If you move from a level 3 certificate and you actually get the diploma in public service interpreting, that would enable you to get different types of jobs. You'd then qualify or become eligible for legal jobs, or certainly a greater number of legal jobs. So again, you'd want to make sure that was updated so that you can qualify for those kind of jobs. Okay, step 7 is receiving and accepting an assignment. So again, if you imagine you've registered with a language service provider, your profile is nicely up to date, including your contact details. So when an assignment comes through that's matched to your profile, so your language, location, experience, etc., you should get a notification. Now, as I've already discussed, that could come from a number of different sources. So one of the key tools in the interpreter toolbox is ensuring that you've got a smartphone. The reason for that is because you might, as I've already said, you might get assignments from text, in which case you need to be able to respond quickly, but also because you might have to download an app to work with a language service provider, so you'd want that as well. Sometimes with text messages or app notifications, language service providers, particularly the bigger ones, use the fastest finger first. So the first to respond to an advert will be the first person who gets it. So for example, if you're an interpreter for Polish, they might have sent a job out to 5 different interpreters, and essentially it's the first one to respond that will get that. Not always the fairest way of doing it, because you might be in an interpreting assignment at the time and unable to actually look at your phone, but that's the way it is, unfortunately. So sometimes they'll give you a bit more time to do that, but if they've got 5 interpreters who all have very similar qualifications, experience, and things like that, then I suppose just allowing the first one to respond is probably the fairest way to do it. So it swings and roundabouts. So the advice with that smartphone as well is to keep it switched on at all times. So I appreciate that you don't want to be sort of working 24/7, and obviously, you know, you want to turn it off overnight. Generally, a language service provider probably wouldn't send you a job overnight anyway, unless you are signed up to a particular client like the police and you are happy to work out of hours and you've let them know about that. But certainly, when I say out of hours, certainly outside the normal sort of business hours, as in outside the 9 o'clock or 5 o'clock time, it's worth keeping it on, because sometimes you might get an assignment in an evening, and if your phone is switched off, then you're not going to pick that up. I appreciate, again, that obviously having downtime is really important, but it doesn't take very much effort to check a text message and respond to it. If you've done that and you've got the work, you can always put it into your calendar and make arrangements for it the following day. So obviously, don't keep this phone switched on if you're in another assignment, because that's unprofessional, and it would doubtlessly generate a complaint if you were to if you were to answer a phone call or send a text message or something in the middle of an interpreting assignment. So again, if you do get an assignment sent when you're in another assignment, that is unfortunate, but it is better to be professional. But once you've received it, you then need to accept it. So generally, again, unless you've got lots and lots of work and more work than you know what to do with, be prepared to be flexible. Sometimes you might have to accept assignments that are not within the time limits that you expected to be working. So you might have to adjust that if you can do. Appreciate that's not always possible due to family commitments. With specialisms, you might need to be flexible as well. So it might be that you've done a lot of medical interpreting and you get an invite to do a social services appointment. Even if you haven't worked in social services before, if you are a good interpreter and you have the time to actually be able to upskill yourself and look into that and do some proper research in that, there's no reason to turn it down. So, you know, be flexible and be prepared to expand your own knowledge and the number of specialisms you can work on. In terms of rates, as I've already mentioned, you might need to be flexible on that as well. Don't compromise yourself too much, but if you've literally got no work coming in and something comes in a couple of pounds lower than the normal rate, then it might be worth taking that just to get some work. Also, time, as I say, so sometimes there might be an appointment that would normally be outside the time that you ideally would be working. But again, it depends on your situation. It depends on how much work you've got. But don't forget as well that by accepting an assignment, you actually build up kudos with a language service provider. You know, you improve the value to them. So occasionally, if they want you to work sort of out of your normal hours, then it's worth doing that, because then they will think favorably towards you. And if they get another assignment, then you'll be one of the first people that pop into their mind. It's really important, though, to only accept assignments that allow you to provide a professional service. So again, depending on how much work you've got, it can be tempting to accept an assignment when you maybe shouldn't do. So again, think about availability. If you're a face-to-face interpreter, you've got an appointment and there's one immediately afterwards, think about the travel time to get between the two. If you literally can't travel between the two and get there in time, or you think you might be able to do, but you might be a bit late, sometimes it's better not to accept it, rather than let one or both of the professionals down. Because again, that won't be good in terms of your reputation with the language service provider. Language as well, sometimes people who speak more than one other language, so more than one language, so English and two other languages, you might be tempted, even though your language in one of them isn't as good as the other, you might be tempted to take on an assignment, or you might be asked to do an assignment with what the language service provider considers to be a similar language to the one that you already speak. An example of that might be European Spanish or Latin American Spanish. But if you're not confident to do that, again, even though it's tempting, it's better to turn it down rather than risk providing a service that isn't up to the mark. And specialism as well. So I've already talked about specialisms. If it's outside of your specialism and you don't think you have adequate time to properly prepare for it so that you can deliver a professional service, then you shouldn't be accepting it. So for example, if it's a specialism you've never worked on before and the appointment's the day after, so clearly that wouldn't give you enough time to do your research and create your glossaries, then really you should be turning that down. But obviously plan ahead and try and look into different specialisms that you might be offered. particularly if you're doing phone interpreting, because you can get all sorts of different calls. There's also a conflict of interest. So again, it can be tempting if you've got something that might be a conflict of interest, but you don't think it's that major, just to say you don't have a conflict of interest. So for example, it might be someone that isn't a direct acquaintance, but a friend of a friend that you're interpreting for. So you might be tempted not to say anything about that, but you're always best disclosing that to the professional if there's any conflict of interest, and allow them to make the decision. If you're honest with that and you tell them exactly what the relationship is, then they will have the information they need to make an informed decision. And if they don't think it will compromise the service that you're able to give, they'll probably give you the assignment anyway, but they'll definitely appreciate your truthfulness. Okay, so the final step is completing the assignment. So once you've accepted an assignment, you of course need to prepare. Now, preparation is absolutely key to providing a professional service, to doing the job to the expectations of the professional, to the expectations of the language service provider, and all of that can help you to build a good reputation as an interpreter, which ultimately should lead to more work. So making sure that you prepare is key. And when we talk about preparation, it's creating glossaries, it's doing your research, it's making sure all of those specialist terms go into your glossaries. And it's also potentially using electronic devices. So just a note about that, some interpreters use glossaries or apps with glossaries on them on a phone or a tablet or something like that. If you are doing that, there's a couple of things to keep in mind. First of all, if it relies on an internet or a phone signal, there's no guarantee that when you're in the assignment, you'll be able to get that. And if that's all you're relying on and there's no phone signal, you can't access your glossary on your phone, then you'll be stuck. The other thing to keep in mind as well is always the look of that and how it appears to the professional themselves. If you can imagine yourself in an interpreting assignment, halfway through you start looking at your phone, what are they going to think? They might think you've gone on Facebook or you've got a message that you're responding to. Either way, they're not going to think it looks particularly professional. But if you are using an electronic device, just let them know at the beginning of the session and make sure they're okay with it. So that if you do start looking at the phone in the middle of it, they'll know that you're looking up a particular term rather than you just sending a text message to someone. As I say, it's always good to have a backup, just in case you don't have the signal, the technology fails or runs out of batteries, or the professional objects to you using it anyway. So it's always good to have paper versions of glossaries and things as a backup, even if you plan to use an electronic device for first and foremost. So when you're actually completing an assignment, there are key things to remember, such as always stick to the Interpreter Code of Conduct. And if you haven't already got one of those or don't know what that is, you can download the NRPSI's Code of Conduct, which is always an excellent marker. Sometimes LSPs will have their own for certain clients or for themselves, but generally the NRPSI one, National Register of Public Service Interpreters, is a good code of conduct to look at. Don't forget to deliver your interpreter introduction, which includes your name and role, the fact that you're going to interpret everything that's said, and also your stop sign, so that if they're talking too quickly or sentences are too long, you can give them a sign and ask them to slow down so you can catch up, and that you'll keep everything confidential. So it's always really important to make sure you deliver that. First of all, because it is part of a professional service, and secondly, because it should make things easier for you down the line. For example, if you do need to use the stop sign. Of course, use your professional knowledge and skills to their greatest extent to deliver that professional service. So that includes your specialism knowledge. It includes interpreting the meaning accurately. It includes avoiding additions and omissions, reflecting register and attitude, taking brief notes so that you don't forget any important information, paraphrasing, asking for clarification where necessary if it's something you don't understand, or repetition if you didn't hear something. And if you do make any mistakes, always make sure you repair them. Of course, if you're not sure about all of these different areas, if you've not done a professional interpreting qualification, for example, then you can often find out, and you should be able to find out about all of these things within a qualification, like the LearnQual Level 3 certificate in community interpreting, for instance. That brings us to the end of the 8 steps to being an interpreter. I hope that's been really useful for you. If you've got any questions at all about that, then you're always welcome to get in contact using our contact details. Thank you very much.